that you have the headsets and you could enjoy this discussion comfortably. On behalf of the Center New Europe, let me welcome everyone, all those present here at this event that we have been willing to hold for quite some time, but today I'd say we can say that the preparation of this gathering has taken some time, but it's topical because NATO standards have already turned into not only some technological benchmark, but also sort of a mythological thing, we might say, because it was politicized. The whole topic has been politicized, and we remember the promises of the previous president, Mr. Poroshenko, to adopt NATO standards by 2020, which practically is in the following year, next year. We have already heard the newly elected president, Mr. Zelensky's declaration about the Ukraine's intention to start adopting NATO standards from 2020. So this meeting, as its goal, has the idea to establish where are we in this movement towards the adoption of NATO standards. We have noticed in recent years that practically all or almost all of Ukrainian politicians who commented on this topic, they had different ideas by uttering these words, NATO standards. In particular, or specifically, we noticed that some people were calling NATO standards the things that were not at all, had nothing to do with NATO standards, but just some certain provisions and certain regulations that were used by NATO. And the things that were mostly used by the alliance member countries. Therefore, in the materials that you can see here today, we wanted that idea to transpire that Ukraine is moving along that path of the adoption of the NATO standards. And if you paid attention to our discussion paper, the topic of which is Ukraine and NATO standards, how to hit a moving target, we would probably start discussing it by saying that NATO standards themselves are not something, fixed, not moving, not transforming. They are being the subject of transformation in the alliance itself. Therefore, that's why we called it a moving target. We are moving towards it, but this target evolves, moves, and that complicates our movement too. So what have our findings been? Catherine, let me turn the floor over now to her. She has put a great deal of efforts in drafting this discussion paper, but I would only like to emphasize it once again that we are not going to start adopting the NATO standards from 2020. We need just to continue adopting them. It was not possible, it's not been possible to adopt all the NATO standards as was promised by the previous leadership. That was obvious from the start. But as of today, Ukraine, according to the data of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and by the way, we are glad to have a representative of the Defense Ministry among us today, 16% is the achieved indicator, and we may even say that it exceeds some of the NATO partner countries' levels, like Austria, for example, and even some member countries. It's not a particularly impressive level, but I'd say that Ukraine looks rather good. against the backdrop of the many other countries who also were pursuing this goal. Thank you. Welcome, dear colleagues. I would like to start probably by thanking many of you, because this topic was not an easy one. I'd like to say that this discussion paper that we are hereby presenting today, it was compiled under the Black Sea Trust for Regional Cooperation, a project of the German Marshall Fund in the United States. And I'm not going to thank all the sponsors and contributors, but let me emphasize the role of the Defense Ministry of Ukraine. We have duly noticed their very, I might say, enthusiastic treatment of this issue. What I would like to add to what Alyona has already said, as far as our conclusions are concerned, first of all, NATO standards and their adoption this issue is all about compatibility and interoperability of the armed forces of Ukraine with the NATO member countries. So this and interoperability idea, it has been fixed in the Charter of distinct partnership between Ukraine and NATO. Therefore, this idea cannot be said to be new to Ukraine. But as these standards have been most actively implemented and adopted since 2015, 2016, we can say that, for example, in 2015, the NATO standards, some of them were introduced into the statutes and codes of the armed forces of Ukraine. In total, there are about 2,000 standards that are in effect in NATO. They have been evolving. Many of them have already been declared obsolete by NATO itself. They were renewed, modernized, and about 1,200, for example. These are the ones that are considered relevant. The STANAG, the Standardization Agreement, as it is called in the NATO parlance, the goal of interoperability is the most important, and each of those agreements can include a number of standards. So when we speak about these standards, we need to understand that if one of these documents is declared obsolete, then their number might be reduced. But we have been assessing the numerical parameters of this process, and we prepared a table that reflects the picture for June of 2019. As you can see from this table, there is not one single country that has already adopted 100% of all the standards. I would like to mention or point out that according to the Ukraine-NATO partnership goals, Ukraine adopted the commitments to review, or to consider rather, the adoption of 119 standards. It's not a binding, so to say, commitment to adopt and apply all of them, but review them and maybe select the ones that are needed for Ukraine and its armed forces. Speaking about the problems that we have managed to identify, we also tried to put together this infographic and you could see the list of the problems presented in the lower part of this infographic. We have been positively impressed by the alliance's positive attitude towards Ukraine and its efforts. We do not thought of only alliance, rating Ukraine, but rather its positive attitude was highlighted and positively perceived by NATO. So if we speak about the problems, the lack of systemic approach, the lack of the experts and specialists, the poor knowledge of English, and a little bit controversial obstacle or problem. This is the problem of obtaining the standards that have some confidentiality in them, the confidential parts. And the problem has mostly been on the Ukrainian side, how Ukraine was making its requests. It also was not fully correspondent to the NATO requirements. So now let me turn.
Розкажіть, будь ласка, трошечки.
Let me now turn the floor over to the representative of the Defense Ministry of Ukraine, and specifically Mr. Oleksandr Kumeda, who is the head of the Department of Standardization, Codification, and Cataloging of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. So what are these problems of adoption of NATO standards for Ukraine specifically? First of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this invitation and this opportunity to partake in this important discussion. It's very topical, and thank you for the work that you have put into this area. Your discussion paper is very important. I've looked through it and I agree 100% with everything that there is there. As far as the issues that you have raised are concerned, what can I say? How can a, so to say, scientific or academic assessment be made of the successfulness of this process of adoption of NATO standards? We can start, in my view, by or with the appearance, the countenance, the bearing of a serviceman, how he is dressed, what's the uniform. Next, certainly, is how well the armed forces are equipped. What are the systems of weaponry that are adopted by the armed forces. I would say also that an important issue was the improvement of food supplies for the armed forces of Ukraine, and I must also point out the better equipment of the Special Operations Unit that was recently created and equipped, that is compatible and interoperable with the Special Operations Forces of NATO units. Another fact that might not yet be known to the public, the early warning system for aircraft defense has been developed, and we improved our interoperability with Hungary and Turkey. And this is probably related to the fact that they also are interested in the maritime operations. I could quote and refer you to more and more examples, but if we speak about problems, they persist, and not only in Ukraine, but in the other partner countries. What are the NATO standards for in general? They exist for the member countries to be capable of operating together to conduct joint operations, different level of operations, or operations of different levels. So this process of adoption of NATO standards is rather dynamic, as you have already mentioned. Every 3 years they are reviewed. Certain provisions of some of them are tested in the military exercises of different sorts. And as you quite correctly pointed out, this process of adoption and its outcome is indeed a moving target. Therefore, we need to take part as much as possible in the work of the working groups of NATO that develop these standards. So I can say that this work is in progress, is being done, and in my view, among the problematic standards, the good command of English should be probably the standard number 1. This is essential even for the people who themselves work on the adoption of these standards, who take decisions on which standards to adopt, which should not be adopted, not needed. As an example, our Air Force, upon the analysis of the NATO standards on rescue operations, it was established that a lot of financial resources were needed for the adoption of that standard, approximately 1 billion hryvnias, so that 12 aircraft be re-equipped for them to be compatible and capable of implementing that standard. We understand that it's not that simple to do that. For example, there are certain things that do not entail significant costs, like, for example, change some signs on the topographical map or geographical maps. But the other aspects, they require substantial funding, and the process of the adoption of a standard is preceded by the process of ratification. NATO country assesses its defense capabilities, it analyzes its military doctrine and other documents, it weighs the financial resources, and having analyzed all that, a country makes a decision whether to adopt this or the other standard or not. So today, and in the future, I hope this process of standardization is going to continue to be voluntary. Nobody forces nobody else to adopt these standards. So it's up to the country to weigh all its possibilities and options and make a decision. The implementation process starts after a document is ratified. National legislation or bylaws are developed after a standard is adopted. The procedure that we now have in Ukraine conforms with the other documents outlining defense policies of Ukraine. We have the mechanism. The only thing is that ratification for some of the documents is not needed, but the evaluation of the options for adopting and applying this or the other document is needed. And certainly the newly adopted documents should conform with the existing laws that are currently in effect in our country. further changes or amendments to the legislation is evaluated, then certainly all the bylaws are reviewed, the regulations, manuals, instructions, and so on. Therefore, this process is quite complex. It requires the involvement of highly the specialists with high expertise, high level of expertise. That's probably all that I wanted to say. Well, certainly our participants will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of our meeting. Now let me turn the floor over to Colonel Tomasz Strycharz, who is the representative of NATO here, and let us thank you for your input, for your contribution into the drafting of this discussion paper. My question to you would be, the Alliance has not been commenting on the adoption process for NATO standards here in Ukraine. And as you represent the Alliance here, and you presumably are well familiar with the Polish practices and experience of Poland in that respect, what would be your assessment, what would be your evaluation? Because we all understand that merely adopting the NATO standards would not mean, the application, practical application of these standards. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. Thank you, Ms. Alyona, for this invitation. Regrettably, the other representatives of the NATO office in Kiev were not able to take part in this meeting. I am a counselor for the issues of security in Ukraine, on security policy even. My Ukrainian is quite poor, but so I will speak English.
First and foremost, I have not so much time to read this very interesting analysis made by New Europe Center, but believe me that I went through these documents and I'm really impressed because you made one of the best analysis which I have read last time. This is really, really good paper, so I appreciate for that. As refers to your question, so first and foremost, I would say that, we are talking about NATO standardization, NATO documents, and implementation of NATO standard to Ukraine. As my predecessor said, a lot of really much work has been done in Ukraine. From my perspective, I can tell you that I'm the lucky man. It's not my first assignment to Ukraine, so I've been here altogether for almost 9 years, no, more than 9 years. I've been there 9 years, okay, anyhow, what I want to prove that from my perspective, from the perspective of person who came here for the duty post in 2010, so you have done extremely huge step forward. So if I compare Ukraine, which took place in 2010 with those Ukraine we meet right now, so it's unbelievable step forward. So this is the first point. Being here, as you heard, I'm military man, so I'm, let's say, somehow straight person, so I can share with you my opinion as far as the implementation on NATO standards to Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about NATO standards all the time, but who knows what means these NATO standards? But even those who know what means NATO standards, no one mentioned here something which is extremely important from our point of view. If we adopt hundreds, thousands of standards. So it's sometimes not enough to be applied to NATO. The most important issue is the mentality, the mindset, that understanding. Once again, I'm really impressed how much work has been done. And let me enumerate, for example, what Ukraine already done. Significant reform steps was adoption of the Strategic Defense Bulletin in 2016. It's really comprehensive roadmap for defense reform. NATO Representation Ukraine advisors, so for example, the people who were before me, contributed to its development and now its implementation. Since then, we have seen particular progress in some areas of defense reform, such as capability-based planning, implementation of unified medical command, combat capabilities development, so special operation forces. My predecessor already said about this. This really good step forward, and visible improvements in NCO training and development. NCO, non-commissioned officer. Positive steps have been taken also in the area of logistics and standardization. There is no doubts at all. In general, since 1914, Ukraine's armed forces have come a long way. Their tactical and technical capabilities have increased significantly, and they continue to benefit from training and equipping programs from a number of NATO allies. I want to emphasize to all of you that, you know, Ukraine took extremely good examples from cooperation with NATO countries. And from my understanding, from our common understanding, it's one of the most important issue is to have a permanent contact with NATO forces, with NATO partners. And if we take into consideration that Ukraine, let me check, only in 2018, Ukrainian armed forces participated in 32 NATO exercises open to partners and NATO nations exercises, with 6 of them taking place in Ukraine. 32 NATO exercises. And as far as I know, so in this year, till end of the 2019, Ukraine plans to participate in 35 NATO exercises open to partners and NATO nations. Such exercises is a good really opportunity to Ukraine, for Ukraine to exchange knowledge with other partners. You will never get experience if you will not be with in the contact with NATO partners. And once again, only having in my experience, when I came here for the first time in 2010, and I was a really lucky man because it was also time when I was in NATO liaison office at those time, but I was part of the IMS, International Military Staff. So I contributed with many Ukrainian officers, high-rank officers, and the comparison between those people from those time with those who are now, so it's unbelievable step. It's really good, huge progress. And at the end, I want to also mention something that I already said that last year you adopted a very important document, which is National Security Strategy. It's really huge progress, and NATO countries, and we can say that all European or Euro-Atlantic environment, we really waited for this step. And adopting a national security strategy, this was the clear sign for us, for NATO, for European or for even Euro-Atlantic countries, that Ukraine is going in the proper direction, but still much work, much job needs to be done. And for example, from this national security strategy, you have to do the next step, which is to implement the documents, documents, this is the law, the 5 crucial law which comes from this national security strategy. Let me enumerate. This is the security service Ukraine draft law. Another one is state secret draft law. The third one is the intelligence law. The fourth one is also draft regarding to intelligence community, and the fifth law refers to the defense industry complex. And we NATO countries, our environment, our community, we really wait for those documents. Seems to us that comprehensive job from your side must be done. If you don't adopt those documents, so you might stop in the one place. So we can estimate that, we hope that in very, very close future, in the hope that in this year those documents will be adopted by your parliament. So once again, I would say that firstly, extremely huge job has been already done in Ukraine. A lot of job is in front of you. And the third, maybe even the most important, is to know what means this adoption of NATO standards. This is not only papers, this is not only documents. I would say that very important is to change, to adapt our mindset, our mentality, our culture, our understanding. Thank you very much.
Дуже вам дякую. На цьому я хотіла би відкрити можливість для запитань і коментарів.
Thank you very much, and with this I would like to give an opportunity to the members of the audience to ask their questions. Petro Kanana, the representative of the Defense Ministry, and I'm the chief of the Division on International Relations of the Ministry of Defense. Your work could be assessed as a very positive, but at the same time, the experts, the journalists, or those people who aspire to become experts, they have only heard to the, so to say, technical part of this discussion, because the membership action plan is not has not been mentioned. That's the document that was adopted in 1991 at Washington Summit. And for those who would like to get better understanding of this process of the adoption of NATO standards, they need to look at a broader picture, the approaches to the defense policies. And here we have this membership action plan, as it is called in English. It is published on the website of NATO, and there is also an English version available, and I use that when I train my apprentices, and it says in the very first line that in 2015 Ukraine declared its ambitious goal. The comparisons that have been done have been relevant, but NATO has not declared its intention to join NATO. So it could have been better if you took as an example Georgia, for example, that declared its intention to join NATO, and their aspirations were acknowledged by NATO. Also, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which is now called North Macedonia, and which is going to be the 30th member of NATO. That would make this comparison table in your discussion paper more, more significant. These are my comments and remarks that are intended for the journalists. Have you published it in English, by the way, on your website? Yes, we did that. And it could be found there. So let me comment on what you've said. We were looking for and we browsed through Ukrainian documents, the documents of the Ukrainian side. All that was related to SANAGs and all these terms, technical terms. If we speak about the explanation of what the term standard means, or NATO standard means, you could find it right here. There is also a picture there. We try to illustrate as much as possible, as effectively as possible, what did the standard NATO standard mean. The comparison table, we use the data that we have had, and what we were informed about was that Ukraine was among the leaders in adopting the NATO standards. If you have any different information, you are most welcome to give it to us, to supply this information to us. Let me emphasize that this is a discussion paper. It's not some, conclusive report or something. We also have here a table that shows the number of standardization agreements, for example, signed by different partner countries and member countries. Germany appears to be the country that signed the largest number of these STANAGs. Unexpectedly, Romania appears to be to have the second place. Maybe we could use Romania's example. Likewise, Montenegro and the other countries are included here. So let me explain it once again, that this discussion paper is for those who would like to understand, the situation, the notion of this adoption, of this process of adoption of NATO standards. Those who would like to get, some quick understanding of, take a look at this infographic. So these are the documents that were meant for different audiences with different goals and intentions. Well, Mr. Petro, you've been quite right in pointing out the things that you have mentioned, but the goal of the discussion paper was to give some, more in-depth understanding of the process of adoption of NATO standards. For example, the AP3, what sort of document is that? As Therefore, I now understand the goal of our today's discussion. We should distinguish between the political principles, we might say, and the standards, because the standards is a broad term, like, I don't know, standards of living. When we speak about specific things, specific documents, then we should include into this range of documents that are related to NATO standards, the documents that have been adopted by specific countries and are applied by them. Any more questions? Igor Polivchuk, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. First of all, I would like to thank for this very consistent and significant document. I'd say that you were quite correct in emphasizing this process of adoption of NATO standards as aimed at a higher level of interoperability. So we are not talking about the mere paperwork in terms of, adopting the standards, approving them, and so on. It also concerns the acquisitions of new equipment, of new weapon system. It is related to the training process, combat training. As last examples, the seminar that is being conducted this week by the Marshall Center and the NATO office with the leaders of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in accordance with NATO standards, and multilateral naval exercises, sea breeze, that are now being in their conclusive stage. They've been conducted not far from Odessa in the Black Sea. So when we speak about the degrees, so to say, of adoption of NATO standards, we could speak about the initial and complete interoperability. We can say that Ukraine is yet at the initial level, but we hope that this work is going to be continued. And let me remind you that the main mechanism for this adoption, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was mentioned in your discussion paper, it's the planning process and the goals of partnership that were determined for Ukraine and the other countries. And in this context, answering the question if Ukraine could or would be able to achieve this goal of adopting the NATO standards by 2020, even if we speak about this requirement to teach English and train the high-ranking officers and the servicemen who directly work in the commands and control centers, providing for communication between Ukrainian and other NATO forces. The goal was for them, for a certain number of these specialists to be trained. But this is a complex process that has been underway for some time. So let me thank you once again for these materials that will certainly be presented to the leading figures of our general staff and the leadership of the armed forces. Thank you, representative of the general staff, for your contribution to our work.
I think I was already requested to give example of my country. I come from Poland, and just to few comments, few things. You already mentioned about that you want to achieve till 2024 standards regarding language skills. I remember time we Poland joined NATO in 1999, and it was a difficult time for us. And believe me that I was young officer, relatively young officer at those time, and we also were in the same place like you are right now. You cannot even imagine how many people, how many militaries didn't speak English at all. Why I want to tell you that this is the normal thing, this is the normal situation that you face with the problem of lack of enough qualified language professionals, and but as far as I know, you all the time you try, your armed forces, general staff, Ministry of Defense wants to and send officers for training courses, for language training courses. But I think that also important is to create the, let's say, modern system of those courses. Sometimes I've met with the situation when you, Ministry of Defense, General Staff, you send your officers for courses when they graduated those courses, so they left army. This is the first thing. And the second point is that seems to me that also it's very important to somehow to rebuild the system as far as the using of those trained officers. I mean, those who completed courses or those who participated in the abroad missions, international organizations. So those officers are very valuable. And I think that it's very important to not to you have to save your sources as far as those people. Yeah. So don't be afraid. This is the process. And as far as the language skills, English language skills. So you are somewhere where we in Poland were in 1999. So don't be afraid.
Дякуємо за обнадійливий коментар, такий reassuring коментарі. Чи є ще запитання, коментарі? Можемо їх зібрати одним раундом, так би мовити, і на цьому підсумувати.
Those who have questions can also ask them now, or just forward them to us after our today's meeting is over. My question is just regards this infographic where all these 160 standards that were intended to be adopted could be found. Yes, we have this table that in which we included the bills of Ukrainian legislation that were drafted for further adoption by Ukraine. And so looking through this table, you could see what are the bills, what are the already adopted acts, and so at which stage Ukraine is in every area of the application of NATO standards. So you don't have the whole list? No, we do not have it, but I'm sure that you can find it elsewhere. Well, we felt that we needed to, present some in a more transparent manner, some information to the public, so that the members of the public have better understanding of this whole process. Well, this information is not confidential. It's in public domain. We inform NATO about the adoption of standards, and we inform also the public which standards have already been adopted and in what form. We might publish as well this list in the website of the Defense Ministry, but it's so to say this information is so specialized that it might not be as interesting. I can say that there was a web page already prepared, already done with the documents that were included into that list, but it has not yet been updated. Vasil Babic, a politologist, a director of the package of reanimation reforms NGO. Speaking about technical side of the NATO standards, what, Mr. Kumeda, in your view, what's the proportion of the NATO standards that might or will require amendments to the legislation, the current legislation, and what could be adopted without any major modification of Ukrainian laws? And the other question is to Mr. Strycharz, the NATO representative. This problem of the lack of language specialists, there could be certainly the shortage of specialists for the institutions dealing with international security and so on. How have you managed to resolve this problem in Poland? Were you adopting some short-term programs or training courses or long-term? And the last question is a political one to Ms. Alyona and to Ms. Kateryna. When we speak about the membership action plan, Ukraine has put forward this mechanism of annual plans, and it informs regularly the NATO or the NATO allies about its progress in implementing them. What's the outcome, in your view, of this process, and how quick it could proceed? Well, the first question, the proportion of between the documents that require legislative amendments and not. It's impossible to answer this question at the moment because it's an evolving process, and as the documents are being reviewed, different decisions are made whether to amend corresponding Ukrainian documents or not. For example, in my line of work, codification, standardization, we introduced and adopted NATO's procedures for codification by issuing a NATO a local order or the national order for the adoption of the NATO coding system. In other areas, there might be the need for the Cabinet of Ministers decrees, like, for example, the military police. What was the second question? The experts and the specialists, where to get them from. Let me be frank with you. There have been situations when we had, very well trained specialists, but they could not speak English at all, or on the contrary, a person can speak English well enough, but is not a specialist in working or developing the policy documents at this level. Therefore, what we are doing, we are trying to put our servicemen, our officers and experts into different training courses.
Let me answer for your question based on my personal experience. In 2005, I participated in a mission in Kosovo. Lucky me, because this mission I couldn't predict at those time. This mission, as you know, was jointly, our Polish mission in Kosovo was jointly together with Ukrainian militaries. It was 2004, 2005, and we created our Polish-Ukrainian battalion together with one Lithuanian platoon. And since we were part of the multinational brigade, which was commanded by Americans, we had to somehow cooperate, speak, communicate with through our change of command with our commanders, American commanders. And I remember that both on our side, Polish side, however, we were in NATO at this time, and on your side, Ukrainian side, there were not many very professionals as far as the English is concerned. But we copied with this, and we tried to do our best to deal with our responsibilities. And believe me that we were very much successful. Why? Because we were in contact, permanent contact with Americans partner, with other partners, with other NATO nations who permanently spoke English language. And this exactly helped us to improve our English skills. And once again, because the question was what to do in case of lack of professionals, language professionals, I would say that we have to do our best. And one of this is to get or to come into contact with NATO partners. For you, it's our recommendation that through the missions, through the training courses, through permanent contact with NATO countries, so you will get or you will achieve this aim. And once again, what to do? So you have to find the best solution, the middle, the golden solution. But I think that one of the most important is to create excellent system, because the worst is if you losing your experience and your well-trained officers with English skills. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Щодо ПДЧ, кілька моментів. Власне, перший момент – це
As far as the action plan is concerned, it's a question for, so to say, top management of the defense system, because the heightened expectations, and especially when they are being bloated, so to say, on purpose, and then nobody can do anything about meeting these expectations. In this situation, skepticism is being born, and in this case, Euroscepticism. And this is also valid for our cooperation with NATO. Second aspect. I think it's if we ask, especially in some public statements, things that would not be given to us, then it would probably it is not the best option. And speaking about the membership plan, we all understand that membership is not a topical issue. And in addition to that, we need to understand why Ukraine needs that. How can we neutralize the risks that a lot of NATO countries view or feel as soon as Ukraine's name is mentioned. Let me say that we practically have our national program that is equivalent to the membership plan, but that is to say that if we have already adopted our national program, then why do we need to bother NATO and develop one more membership plan with them? Maybe we can just show some results in implementing our program. We are able to demonstrate that we have achieved certain results, but we need another plan maybe, or addition to the membership plan on certain areas. Then it's another story. We can discuss that at a later stage when we have shown these results. Well, speaking about getting back to this issue of English language specialists, one more comment. We have been explained by some of our interlocutors. First of all, let me start by saying that it's not difficult to improve one's English. One needs to spend time and maybe money in order to improve his or her language skills. But in the case of armed forces, the ball is, so to say, is in the military leadership pitch. They can introduce some bonus for good command of foreign languages and so on. I would like to make a comment. I am an advisor on security issues, and I'm from Lithuania. So let me switch to English.
My colleague from NLO, that we always talking about one of very important dimensions, technical dimension. What is equipment? What is armament? Other things. We also sometimes starting to talk about processes, changing processes, how we do business in accordance with NATO standards. That's important. We're also talking about another dimension, what are organizations which are implementing everything, which are using new equipment. That's also important. But from my point of view, having experience in Lithuania, most important dimension is human dimension. First of all, to implement all these new things, new standards, you have to prepare people to use new equipment, to use new processes within new organizations. And if equipment, you are able to plan, you have money for next year, so much, and you're planning to implement one or another standard. But to change mentality, to use this new process, because in NATO countries, we're having our values, national differences, and we're using all these standards within this framework. And for Ukraine to start and to came to a place when we are NATO compatible, we are also to be able in human dimension, use all new things. And from my point of view, in 2000, let's say, when I came for first course in Denmark and seeing how everything is done in post-Soviet armed forces and in new forces, the biggest difference I see, how I value my subordinates, how I value the life of my soldiers, what are relations between officer and NCO. These questions are most important from my point of view, and this is really long-term changes. It's not 10 years. In Lithuania, we already 25 years changing, knowing our Lithuanian mentality, and still we are not there. So, to my point of view, very important to start making changes within this human dimension and start talking about long-term things. As example, we already have a discussion within armed forces what is future Ukrainian officer 2030 or future NCO. These things very important to start talking about, having clear idea what is the future officer. Then you will come to this implementation of standards within NATO as it should be. And it's really a generational change. So that's very important to start looking more into this human dimension of coming to closer to NATO standards. Thank you.
Дякую. Thank you very much. Будь ласка, Петро Канапа, а тоді ми зробимо заключні ремарки, і кожен з спікерів тоді може
Я коротенько, оскільки...
Let me be brief, as there have been the representatives of the General Staff speaking, and I am in charge of human resources. Let me clarify, so to say, the picture a little bit. In 2004, the United Kingdom, who was and is a NATO member country, had the website of its defense ministry structured so that any information could be downloaded from it. Today, if you go to the MOD website, you cannot download information from there. So our defense ministry is much more open in this respect, and you can, or one can send information request and get information from the defense ministry. That directly is a reply to your question. You make an information request, you get all the information you need, and otherwise, you know, the journalists, they are all nice people, but they are not servicemen. And sometimes if you ask the journalists to publish some information on a website, it might take a day. In the other case, it might take 2 months. I cannot hear this second interlocutor. So that is the reply to your first question. Second issue, the shortage of specialists. You mentioned the difficulties, for example, you mentioned even the difficulties in establishing the military police. You are well aware of the fact that we have the Prosecutor General's office, we have the Ministry of the Interior, who were reluctant to support this idea of establishing the military police. Therefore, this harmonization, we might say, with the NATO standards, it has had certain impediments. What these impediments have been? Oftentimes, it's the lack of understanding by the top political leadership, and I speak here about the MPs, who do not understand what are we talking about at all. And so this issue of the shortage of the specialists in the defense ministry, in some other ministries and agencies of the executive branch, many even of those specialists oftentimes have very poor understanding of the problems they need to address. Speaking about the action plan, membership action plan, once again, if I am asked, or the other people are asked, what do they know except for the title membership plan? Very few of them would even be aware of the national program of implementation of the membership action plan. Therefore, who is in charge of what? That's what we pay closer attention to here in Ukraine. The education program has been adopted by NATO. We should take that as an example, as a as a role model for us. Thank you, and let me invite our speakers to make some concluding remarks. If you want to add something, Mr. Strycharz.
To line with also what my colleague from NATO liaison office said. But, you know, for me, sometimes the best example to realize how important is exactly is to understand what means NATO standards. So I want to tell you another, let's say, example taken from the real life. 95 years, 1995. So Poland was before joining the NATO, before we joined the NATO, and we were in the program PFP. And I remember I participated in these exercises. It was Spessart 1995, once again, before NATO, before joining NATO. And it was our, let's say, the first after Second World War common exercises, Denmark, Poland, and German exercises, joint exercises. And whereas it was a deal that who takes part in these exercises? Soldiers, simple soldiers. So you know what Poland did? We sent our cadets, of course, everywhere. Cadets are the best soldiers, yeah? Of course, relatively the same age, but we cannot compare cadets to, let's say, conscripts, to the normal simple soldiers. Germany and Denmark, they sent for those exercises, let's say, simple soldiers, conscripts, and Poland sent cadets. Why? Because we, of course, we wanted to show ourselves in the best way. And because it seems to me that we didn't understand what is going on, that, you know, it's extremely important, the understanding, not to show something only for show, but it's important to do something for real life, for real achievement. And summarizing, I want to once again underline that really I be very appreciate if you could stress your colleagues to understand what means this mentality, changing of the mindset, and this common understanding, common approach to NATO standards. Thank you very much.
Дякуємо. Прошу, пан Олександре.
Так, я цілком згоден.
Mr. Alexander, the floor is yours. I certainly agree that we need to change mentality, and I'm certain of that. It will happen. It's inevitable. And I'm sure that the point of not return has already been passed. And we will succeed in repeating the path that Poland has done. And let me just limit to this. Thank you very much. Well, in truth, our today's speakers and our participants have expressed my feelings and my ideas of, very high appreciation of these standards, but certainly I'm now inspired by them to add that the achievement of this mentality changes is also very important. And as you have seen, and you might conclude from our panel discussion, it's been also a point of reference, we may say, a benchmark to us. Certainly, the adoption of the standards is not directly related to the changes of mentality, but we hope that maybe in our case, in case of Ukraine, we will not be waiting for the mentality changes to somehow precede the adoption of these standards. I hope that we would be able to put them in sync, these standards and the mentality changes. And thank you once again for you to have for your taking part in this discussion, notwithstanding this period of summer vacations. And once again, we take a great pride in us being able to develop this document, this discussion paper that we have presented, and we really appreciate your comments, and we are ready to continue working on this issue together with you. Let me add in conclusion that we know that the Ministry of Defense is going to review quite soon the progress that has been done in this realm, and we are going certainly to contribute to this work so that this process is made even more effective and successful. Thank you.